Today I am installing the fuel lines on the Bearhawk Companion, the fuselage itself. But I want to talk about really what is some of the scariest statistics about experimental or home-built aircraft, just like I am doing, and the dangers that I'll be facing one of these days when I finally am flying this aircraft, how I'm going to avoid it, and an operational consideration that I never hear anyone talk about that could help protect us as we fly our aircraft. Let's get into it. Fuel lines on the Bearhawk Companions run out of the wing tanks like we've shown in a previous video, and they're going to run one line on the front of the fuselage in front of the door, one line on the back side of the fuselage. I've already installed these at this point, but let's walk through how I did that. I used a step bit to actually ream out the holes for the T that I was installing. Then I installed it with the appropriate hardware on each side, and then began to mark where I wanted the fuel lines to pass through the bulkheads behind the doorpost. On the Companion, there's only a single front door. There's not a back door, so fuel lines come down behind the back side and in front of the front side. I tapped it with a punch, marked it, and pilot drilled it, and then used a step bit to get it up to size for what originally was supposed to be a union, an AN union, that passed through this bulkhead. Ultimately, I ended up just putting a bushing on this, and the pipe passes through it to the T. Now, this is incredibly tricky, what I'm about to do right here, and I do not recommend this at all. I end up, instead of making a run from the T to that bulkhead on the back and then up, I have one run that goes from this T all the way up and to the tanks. That eliminated one extra joint. In my mind, that eliminates one potential area that could possibly leak that will be inside of the fuselage area, but it was incredibly tricky to bend this up correctly, and I had to just go very carefully, very slowly. And if you're not used to bending fuel lines, especially this 50-52 stuff, it can be frustrating and annoying. I highly recommend practicing with some of this first. There is the option to use the 3003, I believe is what it is, aluminum pipe, which is much more ductile, much softer, but it's also not as rigid, so you may have to add some additional support for it as you're going. From here, I installed the bushing and then bent the pipe up towards the wing root, where I could then wrap it around the interior of the fuselage and connect it to the tanks, which I will do once I am finally attaching the wings to the aircraft. Smoothed out. Up next, I made sure that the line itself perfectly lined up with the fitting. Do not force this. If you're doing anything with fuel lines, bend the tubing to make it line up correctly with the union or joint or whatever you're doing. Don't try to force it, because you'll inevitably cross a thread or you won't have a good seal on that 37-degree angle flare. I actually bent this tube by hand. I know it's 50-52, but just being very careful and trying not to cut too close of a radius, I bent this tubing up by hand to tuck it inside of this aft bulkhead. Then I did use the tubing bender to start the bend for this spot right here where it's going to start wrapping around this back post. And remember, this has got to go inside of the fuselage. I mean, you don't want this on the outside. So you will have to wrap it on the inside of the post, not what I'm doing right here. Actually, I end up realizing this pretty quickly, fortunately, and fix it like you see right here, rolling underneath the tubing of the frame as it bends forwards and to the connection from the tanks. Now that connection will be either rubber hose or flexible line to go from the tank to this line right here. And to make sure that I have enough overage, I have marked with a piece of blue tape where the actual tubes will come out of the fuel tank and go into the fuel lines as they go down to the selector. It makes sense that home-built aircraft have more accidents than a certified built aircraft if you just think about it from a amateur perspective versus a certified or professional builder. But what I found interesting was I began to do a little research on why home-built aircraft have accidents. And I found this study from Kitplanes that was done in 2018, and it looks at data from 1998 up to 2015. And inside of these accidents, things that were not related to loss of control, which is about 30 or 40% of the accidents that occurred in this study, they noticed that in the kit-built aircraft, The biggest percentage difference between the control group, which was just 210s and 172s, and the study goes through and explains why that they use that, as well as why it's a limitation to use that. The first thing that caught my eye when I looked at this graph was fuel starvation. The biggest percentage change, if you look at all of these, the blues versus the red, the biggest percentage change in all of this is the fuel system. So you can see that there was 3 times more accidents in a experimental aircraft than there was in a certified aircraft because of the fuel system. So what I'm talking about, what I'm demonstrating here, this is incredibly important if you're building a Bearhawk or if you're buying an RV. All of those aircraft, these fuel systems, it is the veins and the arteries that get the fuel to the engine, and it is one of the most important things on a pre-buy for a experimental aircraft, but it's also one of the most important things when you're building one. And this is going to lead us up to a discussion here in a few minutes of how fuel starvation and some of these other things, factors that play into that in an experimental aircraft. There are some regulations out there that prevent unporting on a certified aircraft, yet those regulations don't exist on experimental aircraft. So make sure you stick around, watch that demonstration. It will solidify why this is so important. Now let's go back down and keep on working on these fuel lines. For the front line, it's fairly simple. I cut a length of tubing after measuring about how much I would need, and then began at the top bending it into place to make sure that I had enough tube at the end to mark where I needed to connect it to the upper side of that T that we looked at and installed previously. This one is a little bit trickier. You want to make sure it's tucked inside, and I'm either going to come back with some heat shrink or some chafe tape, as well as some maybe Adele clamps as offsets right here. I just picked a spot underneath the door sill and drilled a hole through that. Then I used the 90-degree bit holder and drilled out the spot for the union to pass through. I actually installed another bushing right here for the line, and then I just measured and marked where it needed to come through with a piece of tape, and then just very carefully bent that to get it to go straight through. My idea was I wanted to just get it to pass through the bulkhead, make sure everything looked good from there back up to the tank, and then from there I could bend it as necessary to get it to go down inside of the T. It was a little bit tight to get the bending tool in, so again, just very carefully using a pretty excessive radius, I bent the fuel line enough so that way I could get it to go down into the top of that T. I measure, marked, cut, and then deburred the end of that line. Then I installed my sleeve and nut and made sure to have those on there before I started flaring, and flared the next fitting up. One of the biggest challenges on these fuel lines is actually doing the leg that goes from the T to the gascolator, which is the last portion on this left side. Now, because I have the ability to do this, I went ahead and flared and put the hardware on prior to even getting started. Then I started again at the T, working my way toward the gascolator. So I just wasn't dealing with flaring this after I had put a bend on it. I had the hardware on there. Then I sort of measured and started marking the angles. This is about a 3-way angle, I think. You bend it one direction, then bend it 90 degrees counter to that, then have to straighten it back out. The belly of the aircraft has a contour that is set by the bulkhead at the top of the screen here. Make sure that the fuel line is inside of that. Obviously, you don't want it rubbing up against the skin, so you just want to make sure. I had to rebend this line to get it inside of that bulkhead. Make sure that you don't have any problems with that. Once that's all done, you can then sort of mark where you need to on the floorboard, and I just used a cutoff wheel and a Dremel tool to gently notch out the sheet metal under my floor pan that would allow this to sit down. I ended up having to open this up a little bit more. It wasn't quite as, or it was actually too close. I needed it to be a bigger gap in case that pan moved around, it wiggled a little bit. From there, I marked where I needed to be, cut off, and installed the fittings to attach straight into the gascolator and the fuel selector itself. So let's talk about operational considerations, and something that I want to point out that I'm never going to do while I'm flying the Bearhawk. I will never take off in this aircraft with my fuel selector set on both. I mentioned it earlier that there are some operational considerations that I've thought about and things I'm going to do. And to illustrate why I'm going to do that, it's a fuel starvation thing. Like, I don't want to be on both, and then because of a fuel imbalance, instead of fuel getting into my engine, it's sucking air into the system. Air is obviously less dense than fuel. So if air were to get into the line, it would be drawn into the pump more rapidly than a fuel would. So my argument for not operating with both is that the aircraft, in an event where maybe there's a fuel imbalance, it's been flying uneven, one tank is dry and the other tank has some fuel in it, it will try to draw that air into the system rather than fuel. Let's run up to the house and I'm going to show a simple experiment that anybody can do to illustrate this problem and why a lot of low-wing aircraft don't have a both on their fuel selector. Okay, so I'm back up at the house and I've got two straws that have a different length to them, and I have basically it's a fruit tea watery mix here. I just needed something with some colors so that way you can observe it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually place these straws to where one of them will be sumping from a much lower location, like one of the fuel lines maybe, and the other one will be right there at the top. And the goal is I want you to be able to see what happens when there is air versus fuel being sucked up through the straw. Just because one of them has fuel coming through, it doesn't mean that the pump is going to actually grab and be able to draw up fuel using the other one. So let's take a look at this. So basically, when I am drawing through these straws and they're both beneath the top of the fluid, then I have a suction that draws up the fluid into the pump or the fuel pump, which is, me drawing it in. When I don't have that, when I have a gap to where there's air flowing into the shorter straw, that air it automatically goes in and basically it causes the pump to cavitate or me to not be able to draw fluid in. I know you can kind of see the fluid level sort of staying the same, but I'm drawing air into my lungs and to my stomach because I'm trying to drink it, and it's not allowing any fuel to go up into the pump. That is why I do not take off using the both setting if I have an option. With tanks full, that's fine, but since one of these lines goes to the front of the tank on the Bearhawk, it has the chance for, if I'm lower of fuel or maybe if I'm at a high angle of attack and I'm banking, there's a chance that maybe I don't have fuel, but I have air going through that line and down into my fuel selector. It's just one of the things that I've kind of thought about. If you think I'm dumb about that, if you think there's a better way to do it, explain it to me in the comments. Let's go back down to the hangar though and finish up this discussion. On a high wing, you've still got gravity, but if for some reason, because of an imbalance, one tank was sending more fuel than another, you could get to the exact same scenario, even with fuel flowing from gravity up top. So that's one of the reasons why I just say, even though this has the option for both, it is going to always be safest for me to select a fullest tank before takeoff, get going, and then if I want to run on both, I can run on both at cruise, knowing that I can fix a problem if one were to occur at altitude well before landing or having to find a place to land off field. Huge thing to consider, something that it's just an operational thought that I've had for years, something that I wanted to throw out here, and really am curious to getting your thoughts in the comments on, is it something I shouldn't worry about, or is it possibly something that as experimental aircraft we should take into consideration? All right, so I am just now getting back down in the hangar to work on these fuel lines. Thought I'd just give you a little sample of what is taking me so long on this build. So on top of like just normal routine mowing the runway and taking care of stuff around here, we tilled our garden today, got that planted. I ended up having to get this old mower of ours running today. The battery's messed up. So basically the alternator's working, but the battery is not being charged. So it'll start and then run, but when you shut it down, it's dead. One of my family members' vehicle was low on air, so I just got some air and put it in their tires. And now the sun is setting on the strip, and I am just now getting down here and getting started on this. So been off all day, done a little flying up at Gallatin this morning in the Cub up there, doing some tailwheel endorsement stuff. But that's just a little snapshot of why this is taking so long. But we're getting into summer, and hopefully as I get out of regular scheduled classes, I have plenty of time to work on this. This is not a bad view right here. Next, I actually ran a union through the bulkhead behind the aft door post, so that way I didn't run a single line straight through like I did on the pilot side. This one I cut to length and then flared using the aviation flaring tool, and then installed it tucked inside of the doorpost frame and wrapped around, but I kind of messed up as I was doing this. So I may have just messed up. Here is how much extra. This is where the line from the fuel tank will actually come out of the wing. And you can see I've got an extra at least 6 inches here. I don't know if it was just I marked the wrong spot or what. This one looks great. You know, it starts down here and it goes from the joint or the union up. It tucks very neatly inside of that little cavity. It wraps around the backside. I'm gonna work on this piece back here and clean this up a little bit. But it is just exactly the length it needs to be, which is not great. I don't know if I need to redo that or just risk it and hope that when we put the plane together and that's inside of some, aircraft fabric, that everything's okay. Next, I ran from the bulkhead union towards the T that splits off and goes to the selector and then to the front of the tanks. This is a little bit more of a challenge because I did have to get that flare to sit flush. So I had to sort of double bend to get that to go correctly and try to mitigate any low spot in the fuel line. It worked out just fine. I ran some heat shrink up in between the tube and the frame and then shrunk it down so that way it would act as chafe tape. Additionally, I'm going to put some silicone tape around this. Next, I cut the tube into place, flared it, and attached it to the T. I went ahead and drilled then through the front bulkhead and step drilled it all the way up to the proper size to let another union or a bushing through. But I ended up doing the piece that runs towards the gasculator next and made a big mistake during it. All right, so I messed up here. This is what you don't want. So that is right here, this kink or this really, really sharp bend that you can kind of see in that. That is, I bent it so much that like the entire sidewall is starting to collapse on it. So this is no longer airworthy. This is no longer good. I'm going to basically just cut it here and restart. So this is really the first time I've had to do that, but it goes to show that anybody can have this happen to you, and don't risk your life for 6 inches of tubing. Cut it off, redo it, order more if you need it. I don't think I will, but if I do, I've got a spruce order set up, ready to go, and we'll just see. We'll see what happens here. I've got the line on the front to finish as well as the line underneath, and that's what this was going to, obviously, and it's just bent. So botched that up, but let's just start over. Basically, I'm turning it once, tightening it until it breaks loose, just like that. Flip it over right there. All right, I think that's got the fuel line into the gascolator finished. Now really all I have to do is run it from the gascolator out to the fuel pump itself, the electric fuel pump, which will likely be under the floorboard right there, maybe under the rudder pedal, somewhere where I can access it pretty easily. If I go with an IO360 engine, it'll have to have that additional electric pump. So that's kind of what I'm thinking here, is if I do find one of those, that I'll just run it into the electric pump out of the gascolator and then directly into the engine pump itself. I don't really need that. I could do a flow test, and my guess is it would, for the horsepower of the engine, it would produce enough flow for me to actually do without, but I'm gonna look into it anyways. So now all I've got left is this one from the back side of the T to the front top. For some reason, these fuel lines are actually somewhat therapeutic or enjoyable for me to do, and sort of the problem solving of bending it around the airframe, making sure it's inside of the fabric, making sure that it's not an area that's going to damage it as a passenger gets in and out, things like that, I've really enjoyed in this process. It did take me longer to edit this video than I intended. This has been done for like a month or so. But there's some really cool things that have happened. It's actually more than I can even share in one video. So over the next few weeks and months, I'll be sharing some of the cool developments that have occurred with this build, some of the things that are coming down the pike, some of the really cool partnerships I've been very blessed to be a part of. And I look forward to sharing all of that with you, as well as some things unrelated to the Bearhawk, but related to another project I've done previously on this channel that I'll be doing this summer. So make sure you stick around, and thank you for watching. Have a great day.